Hello, this is Brendan Thompson from Catholic Voices, and it's a pleasure to be able to stream this video to look at Fratelli Tutti, which is the title of Pope Francis's newly released encyclical dedicated to fraternity and social friendship. So Pope Francis has signed this encyclical yesterday as we record, so on October 3rd at the Basilica of St. Francis in Assisi. And this has been his first trip out of the Vatican since the pandemic started. And it was released today as we record on Sunday, the 4th of October. So I'm hoping in this short video that we have a chance to look at some of the context, the background behind this document, where is it coming from, to look at some of the structure, how the document is structured, what's the kind of the journey throughout the document that the Pope Francis takes us on, and then finally to look at some kind of key insights that have really struck me, particularly when it comes to kind of telling the Church's story, which is the mission of Catholic Voices. But first, before we get into any of that, if I had to sum up the document in a line, in a sentence, I've been thinking as I've read the document, what is it saying to me? How would I describe it in a sentence? And this is what I've come up with. So it's something along the lines of, in reaction to forces in society at all levels that are seeking to divide and destroy, Pope Francis here is calling us to build a culture where we come together and we build. So that's what I'm taking away from it in a sentence. So there's a call to Christians, but also people of all convictions, to come together to turn away from a culture that's polarization and what he calls a throwaway culture, and towards a culture of fraternity. And so this document unpacks what those cultural shifts look like. So let's start with a bit of context and background. So this is Pope Francis's, well, it's technically his fourth encyclical, but let's kind of bracket Lumen Fide, which is his first one published in 2013. Bracketing it mostly because it was seen as a kind of collaborative effort, mostly written by Benedict XVI and published under the pontificate of Francis. But I think you could call this in a way his second Franciscan encyclical. And by that I mean it's taking its direct inspiration from the life and the ministry of St. Francis of Assisi, and of course where Pope Francis takes his name from. So the first Franciscan encyclical being Laudato Si in 2015 on creation and care for the common home. So I think if we see Pope Francis's three encyclicals, so this is Evangelii Gaudium, Laudato Si, and now this one Fratelli Tutti, we see them as a kind of a triptych, so kind of a religious icon that you open. There's got two panels and a central panel, and I think that this triptych of documents now gives a sense of Pope Francis's kind of top three priorities that he's been focusing on during his pontificate, but also I guess the three vital relationships from the perspective of theology and faith. So Evangelii Gaudium is predominantly about our relationship with the Creator as creatures, believers, as people of God. Laudato Si is our relationship with creation. And then Fratelli Tutti is our relationship with fellow creatures. So there's a little bit about evangelization, the environment, and the bonds of belonging. So I think that's a good way of kind of seeing the overall picture of where Fratelli Tutti fits in within Pope Francis's literature or his encyclicals. The kind of key notions behind all of them, you have this sense of the restoration of joy, which is a very Franciscan idea. So we hear all the time that, Evangelii Gaudium, the joy of the gospel, and all of these things, a living encounter with Christ through his church ought to bring about joy. This is something that's a kind of key theme in Francis's pontificate. And you can see they're inspired by Pope Francis, by St. Francis, who could aptly be called the saint of fraternal love. So let's begin with the title. So Fratelli Tutti, there's been some controversy here. Is it gender inclusive? And I think the first line of this answers it. The Fratelli Tutti, it's a direct quotation from a document of St. Francis. And in the first line, it says that this is an all-encompassing way. Fratelli is a plural, right? So the document actually begins, Fratelli Tutti, with these words, St. Francis addressed his brothers and sisters and proposed to them a way of life marked by the flavour of the gospel. So right off the bat, it's trying to kind of sidestep or say that, this there's no need for this controversy in a certain sense. So it would kind of move beyond it to the kind of core message of the document. And in terms of inspirations, where this document is coming from, it's also a meditation. The document says on the document on human fraternity, which he signed in February 2019. So in February 2019, it was the 800th anniversary of a famous meeting of St. Francis of Assisi with Sultan Malik al-Kamil. So this was during the Crusades, and it was seen as a really quite bold fraternal gesture or interreligious fraternity. And so Fratelli Tutti begins with this, and it kind of appeals to it at the end, and it follows from this document signed with the Grand Imam of Egypt. So I'm quoting directly from the document now in talking about the sources for both Laudato Si and Fratelli Tutti. And it says, in preparation of Laudato Si, I had a source of inspiration in my brother Bartholomew, the Orthodox Patriarch, who has spoken forcefully of our need to care for creation. And in this case, speaking about Fratelli Tutti, I have felt particularly encouraged by the Grand Imam Ahmad al-Tayyib, with whom I met in Abu Dhabi, where we declared that God has created all human beings equal in rights, duties and dignity, and has called them to live together as brothers and sisters. This was no mere diplomatic gesture, but a reflection born of dialogue and common commitment. And the present encyclical takes up and develops some of the great themes in the document that we both signed. So that's a little bit about its inspiration, where the document is coming from. It's kind of building on these concrete examples of fraternity that Pope Francis has been modelling. And one of the things we, of course, can't ignore in the publication of this document is the COVID-19 pandemic. And so there's a kind of question that is right off the bat, which is this document in any way a response to COVID? And the answer is no and yes. So in one sense, as it says in chapter 7, it says, at the time of writing, the COVID-19 pandemic was unexpectedly erupted, exposing our false security. So this document had been in preparation for well over a year since that meeting in February 2019. But there's also a yes, in a certain sense. It says, aside from the different ways that various countries have responded to the crisis, their inability to work together became quite evident. For all our hyperconnectivity, we've witnessed a fragmentation that made it more difficult to resolve problems that affected us all. So, in other words, the COVID pandemic, the crisis, has, in a sense, kind of heightened the urgency and the relevance of rediscovering fraternity. So it's kind of exposed the faults within the system, of which fraternity Pope Francis offers as a kind of a response or an antidote to it, to the kind of crisis of modernity. So that's a little bit in the way of background, of context. So let's look at a real bird's eye view of the document in terms of its structure and its shape. So here we'll be helped by looking at an overview, which we'll look at in a second. But let's return to a kind of key idea. What's the kind of key idea behind the document? Could we say? So I think I've given my thought before, but I think even to kind of focus it further, you could say, in order to be saved, Pope Francis is saying, we need to rediscover fraternity. And this is, as we've already mentioned, this is a way of responding to some of the crisis at the heart of modernity, of the project of modernity. And I think the easiest way of kind of describing something of this, if you think, what is modernity about? You could take the motto of the French Revolution, liberté, égalité, fraternité. And you think in society, well, actually, when it comes to liberty, we spend a lot of time talking about personal liberty, freedom, equality. We spend a lot of time talking about equality. And Pope Francis is saying, in a sense, we don't talk that much about fraternity. And what happens without fraternity is that liberty and equality become a little bit lopsided. So there's a kind of thought to get us started. How do we rediscover fraternity and the reflections, the insights that come from the heart of the gospel that can speak into this modern predicament or the crisis of modernity? So let's have just a brief look over an overview of the document. So here's a little overview of the various chapters. So, beginning with what's called dark clouds over the world, over a closed world, stranger on the road, envisaging and engendering an open world, a heart open to the whole world, a better kind of politics, dialogue and friendship in society, paths of renewed encounter, religions at the service of fraternity and in our world, and then a kind of final appeal. So as documents go, it's 43,000 words, so it's quite a substantial document. Comparing it to the other two documents within the triptych we spoke about, Evangelii Gaudium and Laudato Si are longer. So Evangelii Gaudium is about 47,000 words and Laudato Si is about 45,000. So it's shorter, but still, it's in the 40,000 region. So it's a substantial read and covers quite a lot of ground. So I want to just look at some of the chapters. We won't have time to look at all of the chapters in great depth, but I just want to kind of give a bird's eye view looking over the structure and what are some of the kind of key themes arising before talking about some key insights that have struck me. So first of all, we've got chapter 1, which talks about dark clouds over a closed world, which is as apocalyptic as the title suggests. So it's kind of uses analogy of a cloud over a closed world. So this cloud extends, the document says, to all parts of the world, hindering the development of universal fraternity. And the effects of this cloud is that it creates circumstances that leave many people wounded by the roadside, discarded and rejected. The clouds plunge humanity in confusion, isolation and desolation. But despite these dark clouds, we need to be aware of the new paths of hope that God continues to sow abundantly. Pope Francis is saying seeds of goodness in our human family. And so the Pope reminds us, or he kind of calls us or reminds us that love, justice, solidarity are not achieved once and for all. So it's not like, oh, okay, we're done now. They have to be built day by day. So there's a kind of continual conversion of heart or renewal that's needed. So after kind of setting the scene a little bit, this kind of dark cloud scene, he moves into the second chapter to an exegesis of a quite familiar Bible story, the story of the Good Samaritan, in a chapter called A Stranger on the Road. And he offers the parable of the Good Samaritan as a way of a light that pierces the dark cloud in a certain sense. So the parable takes us back to the earlier question that begins the parable. Jesus begins, who is my neighbor? Where is my brother? So God leaves no room for a kind of a determinism or a fatalism that's a justification for indifference. Instead, he encourages us to create a different culture, one in which we resolve conflicts and care for one another, because we have one creator who's defender of the rights of all. So we know in the story there's a stranger on the road, wounded, cast aside, and amid the dark clouds of a cold world, of a closed world. And so faced with this reality, Pope Francis says he uses this story as a way of saying there are two attitudes one can take when faced with this reality. So we can pass by on the other side of the road, as some in the story did, or we can stop and be moved by pity. And so it's this decision to include or exclude those lying wounded on the roadside that Pope Francis is saying almost should become our criterion for judging every economic, political, social, religious project. This is the key, in a sense, for Pope Francis to challenging a throwaway culture. So these difficulties, these can be very difficult. These difficulties are opportunities for growth. Pope Francis is kind of reframing it as not excuses for kind of glum resignation. For the whole is greater than the part. So this is the kind of call to fraternity that we need to come together when it comes on this. Reconciliation will give us new life and set us free from fear. And finally, Jesus is the one who will transform the form of the question to what it means to be a neighbour, what our relation is to one another. So we're called to a practice of universal love that's able to overcome historical prejudices, cultural barriers, and petty interests. So, running with the story of the Good Samaritans and these kind of reflections, a call for a universal love, then we move, in a sense, there's a shift into the third chapter, which you could say is, in a sense, the intellectual and spiritual heart of Fratelli Tutti. And it's dreaming. It's called envisaging and engendering an open world. So we've spoken about this closed world, the clouded, closed world. Well, what does an open world look like? One in which the path of openness to the other is taken. Well, the chapter begins with a call, a reminder that God is the one who's universal love. And since we're part of that love, share in it, we're called to universal fraternity, which is openness. So there aren't others or them, there's only us. And this universal openness at this point is not kind of a geographical one. He'll talk about migrants a little bit later, but it's a kind of existential openness. It has to do with our daily efforts to expand our circle of friends, to kind of reach toward the margins, to include those whom I don't naturally consider as part of my circle of interest, even though they might be close to me. Just thinking, where do I draw the limits? Where do I have my own kind of, closed system? And therefore, who do I leave on the road abandoned or ignored in the society in which I live in? And all of these people, whether they be homeless, refugees, those who are beyond, in a faith sense, who are those people I'm called to reach out to, who are existential foreigners in a certain sense? And the answer, or the solution to this, Pope Francis is saying, is fraternity as social friendship. But what is social friendship? Social friendship is a love capable of transcending the borders, these kind of arbitrary borders we create. So it creates the conditions of universal openness. The future is not monochrome. And the call really here is that the human family needs to learn to live together in harmony and peace without all having to be exactly alike. Fraternity isn't born, the document goes on to say, in a climate of just individual liberties or just even a certain administrative, guaranteed equality or even purely political or economic solutions. Nor, as it says, interestingly, it achieved just by an abstract proclamation that all men and women are equal. Instead, it's the result of conscious and careful cultivation of fraternity. And it says we'll only have peace when we're able to provide land, housing, work for all. Real and lasting peace will only be possible on the basis of a global ethic of solidarity and cooperation and in the service of the whole human family. So you can see this is why this is a social encyclical. Here we see, and those familiar with Catholic social teaching will see the kind of resonances and the connection here in this document. Chapter 4 goes on to talk about some creative tensions, I guess you could say, some polarities between looking at the global versus the local, this open system versus closed systems, national versus universal, in a chapter called A Heart Open to the World. So given the desire of many to experience social friendships, to seek what's morally good, to practice social ethics, how do we live, or how do we encounter solidarity? And one of the ways he says is a call really to what he calls gratuitousness. And he defines gratuitousness as being able to do things simply because they're good in themselves. So as Christians and people of all convictions, we need to be more gratuitous, not doing things just with the concern of personal gain or what I get back in return. So this is only a social and political culture that's imbued with a spirit of gratuitousness will have a future. And we tend to be gratuitous to those people who we consider close, those who are family in a sense and close friends. I'm willing to go above and beyond for those who are close to me. So it says when we change the way that we see our relationship with others, seeing others as brothers and sisters of a universal family, of true fraternity, then this gratuitousness arises naturally. There's a desire to serve people regardless of the personal cost. And in here he then talks about the reactions as a kind of litmus test of how we treat migrants. So we haven't got time to go into that, but this is around chapters 129 to 130, talking about basically that every healthy culture is opening and welcoming, and gives some specific kind of political challenges there. And the remaining chapters, really, I don't want to kind of go too much in depth into all of them. I really encourage you to read the document. But chapter 5 it's really all about a regeneration of politics in service to the common good. So it's like, how do we do a better kind of politics? So there's some really interesting thoughts and insights there. Chapter 6 I find really interesting from the purposes of evangelization and communication. So it's the regeneration of civility, of dialogue, of social friendship, communication, consensus, and avoiding polarization that happens. So we'll come back to a little bit about what it says about dialogue, because I think it's very interesting, particularly from the perspective of Catholic Voices. Chapter 7 talks about peacemaking, so dealing with conflict on a local and an international level, nuclear weapons, a kind of very strong call against the death penalty, against war, and a reform of the UN. So there's some wide-reaching implications to this document, and calls and challenges. And then the document ends, it's coming into land now, in chapter 8 with the role of religions in service of fraternity, of avoiding violence, and really kind of following from the Abu Dhabi document signed in 2019. So that's a little bit of the overview of this document. So I want to end with just some thoughts and some reflections, some things that have struck me, particularly arising out of kind of chapter 6. So we've got this document now on fraternity, social friendship, and it's meant to remind us all, remind us of the call of St. Francis to a love that transcends the barriers of geography and distance, and declares blessed all those who love their brother, as much as when he is far away from him as when he is with him. So this is the second Franciscan document following from Laudato Si. And I think you could almost say that if Laudato Si was about what we call integral ecology, a kind of connected up way of trying to see things as God sees them when it comes to care for creation, so an integral ecology, you could say Fratelli Tutti is calling for an integral humanism. So, a kind of similar picture. So for St. Francis of Assisi, the two things were not disconnected. It wasn't nature apart from people. And it says in the document in the second chapter, Francis himself felt a brother to the sun, the sea and the wind, yet he knew he was even closer to those of his own flesh. So what does this look like? And I think chapter 6 is really interesting here from the perspective of dialogue. What does true dialogue look like? So there's a really wonderful quote in chapter 200. It says, dialogue is often confused with something quite different. The feverish exchange of opinions on social networks, frequently based on media information that is not always reliable. These exchanges are merely parallel monologues. They may attract some attention by their sharp and aggressive tone, but monologues engage no one, and their content is frequently self-serving and contradictory. So I think I recognise that within some of what happens in social media, whether it's social media in general or even social media among Catholics. No one is free from the kind of temptations of the ego that social media can bring, and the division, the polarisation it can create. So what does true dialogue, not just kind of parallel monologues, look like? And I think it says we need to find, and this is really, I'm sympathetic to this in Catholic Voices, where we talk about finding common ground and connecting to the positive value of the other as a way of beginning dialogue. And Pope Francis seems to be saying much the same, which is we need to find consensus to go after truth. So elsewhere in the document, in chapter 208, he says, we need to learn how to unmask the various ways that truth is manipulated, distorted, and concealed in public and private discourse. What we call truth is not only the reporting of facts and events such as we find in the daily papers, it is primarily the search for solid foundations sustaining our decisions and laws. When I read this, I was really reminded, it's the 10th anniversary this year, last month, of Pope Benedict's visit, or papal visit to the UK. And in the kind of one of the central events was an address to civic and political leaders at Westminster Hall. And I remember within that speech there is a similar call to this kind of consensus, saying, well, what is it that unites society? If it's just broad, political consensus, that's not really deep enough. We need deeper foundations. So Pope Francis, in a way, reiterating this call. So there's plenty of wonderful parts of this document, so much kind of gold to mine when it comes to looking at this. So some final thoughts before we finish up with this video is, what is the political situation that this is speaking into? Some people have noticed that, is this kind of talking into the American election? There's been some stuff in the news about saying, to what degree is this kind of timed for that? Well, I think it's fair to say that when Pope Francis released a document, he doesn't have a particular country's election in mind. You think however many countries the Vatican, has, the Holy See has a presence in, there are always elections going on whenever you're releasing a document. But certainly he does want it to speak to the American people, as he wants it to speak to all people, regardless of, if they're Christians, other religions, or people of all convictions, as it says. So it was released for the feast of St. Francis of Assisi. I think that's the kind of primary thing. So there are these other kind of political things that are on the horizon, and they're important to take into account. But I think this is the kind of primary thing. It's not trying to, nudge or speak into the American election in any way. But I think it is fair to say that this is political. Much of what it says is political and a challenge to kind of the way we do politics, a call to do better politics. But it's not just a critique of one side. It's a quite nuanced critique of politics on all sides. So, of technocratic liberalism as well as kind of populism. So the left as well as the right are challenged, or should see and receive challenge in this document. There's a highlighted need for the kind of dialogue that will allow fraternity, a culture of fraternity, to flourish. And what we see from the pandemic is that this need for fraternity has been made more urgent and relevant. So I think this document is providential. The crisis of modernity has meant that the bonds of belonging that were already ripping at the seams, the bonds of belonging of families, of cultures, of societies, what Pope Francis has called elsewhere as, kind of liquidity. We're not just in a change of era, we're in an era of change. We're in such a different time. So how does fraternity help us to kind of undo some of the damage of the crisis of modernity? So there's this real, and the answer is there's this real need to recover our sense of being brothers and sisters in order to move forward. We need to recover fraternity if we're going to move forward in the light of this crisis. So to end, I just want to end how Pope Francis ends in the encyclical with some of the saintly inspirations from Catholic inspirations and other religious traditions that Pope Francis says. So I'll give Pope Francis the last word, which probably seems appropriate. But in the final two chapters, he's reflecting on people who, for him, model this call to fraternity of universal love. He says, beginning 286, in these pages of reflection on universal fraternity, I feel inspired particularly by St. Francis of Assisi, but also by others of our brothers and sisters who are not Catholic, Martin Luther King, Desmond Tutu, Mahatma Gandhi, and many more. Yet I would like to conclude by mentioning another person of deep faith, who, drawing upon his intense experience of God, made a journey of transformation towards feeling a brother to all, and I'm speaking of Blessed Charles de Foucauld. Blessed Charles directed his ideal of total surrender to God towards an identification with the poor, abandoned in the depths of the African desert. In that setting, he expressed his desire to feel himself a brother to every human being, and asked a friend to pray to God that I truly be brother of all. In the end, he wanted to be the universal brother. Yet only by identifying with the least did he come at last to be brother of all. And may God inspire that dream in each one of us. Amen. So thank you very much for joining us for this first look at Fratelli Tutti. Go and read the document and let us know in your reading what things have struck you. Thank you very much, and God bless.